I'm Simon Cox, and this week in The Report, we investigate whether the government's flagship scheme to get the long-term unemployed back into work can succeed where others have failed. Yesterday's rise in unemployment was unwelcome news for the government, but it has a solution. Get the private sector to deal with the long-term unemployed and only pay these companies once they get people into work. In The Report this week, we investigate what's being called a welfare revolution and whether there's any evidence that the new work programme can succeed where so many others have failed before.
Private providers performed far worse in getting people back into work than Job Centre Plus, the state provider, and they massively missed their targets.
It's a big gamble for the government, and we hear concerns that just months into the scheme, little has changed, with companies who failed previously being given contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds.
The big players are still there doing the same thing. The bigger the company, the more money you have, and unfortunately that is what it boils down to. It's not about quality of service.
Everybody knows me, I'm Rachel. If you don't know me, then you will be getting to know me this morning, really luckily for you. So we're for...
I'm in Remploy in central Manchester, which is one of the organisations who won work programme contracts. Busy morning here, they've got 2 sessions on. There's a group who are doing online applications for jobs at McDonald's, and in the other there's a group who are doing job searches.
So we've got Asda in Altrincham.
Boots City Centre, that'll be alright.
If you go on the Boots website or just Google Boots vacancies, you can move them out over to the other side if you want.
Anthony's been without a job for over 3 years, so like all the long-term unemployed, he has to go onto the work programme. He's been sent to Remploy, a small, brightly lit office with a dozen computers where people can apply for jobs.
I feel like I'm in a better place already because I've been on this course now for about 8 or 9 weeks and I've already had like 3 interviews and been able to apply for more jobs. So, things are already looking up. I might not have actually got work yet, but, this course lasts for 2 years, so, hopefully I won't be here for 2 years. Hopefully I'll be,
If Anthony doesn't succeed, he won't be the only one losing out. Remploy and the other organisations involved in the work programme only get paid if they find someone a job who then keeps it. That's a big change to previous schemes, and when the programme was announced earlier this year, the Prime Minister was bullish about its prospects.
The work programme is the biggest back-to-work scheme this country has seen since the 1930s. And instead of being cash-limited and patchy like his schemes, it has no limit. It can help as many people as possible from all of those different categories.
You can see the political appeal of a scheme which pays by results. But actually getting employment for the long-term jobless is a lot harder than it sounds.
I thought what we'd do it on is you work in possibly 30 hours plus at a wage of about £6 an hour.
This was one of Labour's attempts to tackle the problem.
In comparison, you would be better off by £180 and 3 pence a week.
The Pathways to Work scheme targeted areas like the Welsh Valleys, where up to 15% of people are claiming sickness benefits. Large private companies were brought in to get this group into work. But crucially, the Job Centre was also trying to do it as well. But like many of the claimants, it didn't work.
Private providers performed far worse in getting people back into work than Job Centre Plus, the state provider.
Margaret Hodge was an employment minister in the last Labour government and now chairs the Commons Public Accounts Committee. Last year, it produced a withering assessment of Pathways to Work and, in particular, the performance of the private sector in the scheme.
They tended to cherry-pick, so they got those that were closest to the labour market, those who volunteered for the programme rather than those who were pushed onto the programme. They were working in areas which were much easier, so there were many more jobs available in the local labour market. And despite all that, they massively missed their targets.
Just how much became clear when the committee questioned executives from Reed in Partnership and A4E, 2 of the companies delivering the Pathways scheme.
13%.
13.
1-3. Yeah.
13% against 50% target?
Yeah.
Wasn't very good, was it?
The committee laid bare the inability of these firms to reach the minimum target, placing a third of people referred into employment.
Yeah.
Devon and Cornwall, 16%.
Right. So in most cases, less than half what you were supposed to get.
But in spite of this failure, A4E still made a profit on the contract. So how does Nigel Lemon, head of welfare for A4E, assess their performance?
We certainly exceeded targets in some geographies. We found it more difficult in others. But many of these programmes start off with challenges and with us learning how to do them and work with our customers.
I'm interested when you say you did better in some areas. I mean, looking at when the Public Accounts Committee had looked at this, I couldn't see the areas where you had even met the minimum targets.
I don't, unfortunately, have those figures in front of me. I'm talking from our own internal measures of performance.
The evidence from the Pathways to Work project is that bringing in private firms isn't a panacea. But Margaret Hodge says coalition ministers chose to ignore this.
I am disappointed that the government didn't really pay heed to what we were saying about the relative performance between the private sector and the public sector, and appears ideologically to have totally privatised that welfare to work programme.
So why did the government take job centres and the public sector out of the equation? Dan Finn is Professor of Social Inclusion at Portsmouth University and an expert on welfare to work systems.
The evidence on this is mixed. My own view is it's more to do with how well contracts are designed, implemented and managed than it is to do with whether it's a public agency or a private agency that are actually delivering it. On the immediate level, Job Centre Plus had done better, but Job Centre Plus had been running the programme for 6 or 7 years. The private sector was the new kid on the block in that kind of respect. The other thing was that the arrival of the private sector on the scene also has the intended consequence of encouraging the public sector to perform better than maybe it was previously.
Professor Finn believes the best model is the private and public sector competing against one another. But the Department for Work and Pensions ignored him and other advisers who suggested this. The biggest surprise to Margaret Hodge was how the private sector didn't try to hide its lack of success.
I'm amazed that they revealed so easily their failure to perform. Now, what they said, which really, I think, slightly shook me, was that they hadn't anticipated the difficulty in tackling this particular cohort of people.
That's because it's difficult to do, and all previous attempts to tackle this hard core on benefits haven't worked. One solution often mentioned is some good old-fashioned tough love.
Benefits ground your lone parent, blah, 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 blah. Sapping off system, can't be bothered to work, staying at home and using the kids as an excuse. You've heard it all before, haven't you?
Hayley Taylor is a master of this. In Studio Lambert's programme for Channel 4, Benefit Busters, Hayley was transformed from an employment advisor with A4E into a jobs guru dubbed the Fairy Job Mother. Unfortunately for the government and the companies on the work programme, she says contrary to popular belief, there's no quick fix.
A lot of people's expectations aren't realistic. And that's something that I always address. You know, if we haven't got the academic qualifications, we're not going to be a rocket scientist. You know, the government have never lived the lives of the individuals that I work with. They have no comprehension of what it's like to live in such a deprived area where everyone around you is in the same boat. They're all claimants. It is very difficult to move on in life and aspire to be anything when you've been brought up in a family that's always held you back. It's like baggage. They are still carrying it around with them, on top of the pressures of possibly going into work, on top of the pressure of I must keep this job, I must provide for my family. It becomes overwhelming and that person falls back down again.
The government should know just how difficult it is. Research by the Department for Work and Pensions published this year broke job seekers down into different categories. It showed that almost half the people claiming benefits aren't looking for work, and many of them don't want to.
Somebody's got to want to work. If they don't want to work, no matter how much you give them in terms of CVs and job opportunities, if they don't want to work, then you're never going to force them to.
Philip Collett runs a training consultancy, Goals UK, which works with the long-term unemployed. His experience is that the kind of advice normally trotted out on welfare schemes won't work with this group.
There are people who are determined not to work. There's 8 different segments, and they go from determined seekers, who make up about 17%, according to the research, to the people who are considered to be defeated by their circumstances. The determined seekers spend 24 hours a week on average looking for work. The disillusioned guys are spending 0 to 3 hours a week looking for work.
So far, we've only looked at the evidence from one previous scheme. The work programme's predecessor, the Flexible New Deal, also extensively used private training companies to target the long-term unemployed.
The facilities were often poor. The materials that they often gave you for the job search was pretty lax. Usually consisted of newspapers. Sometimes the yellow pages were out of date, so if you wanted to find out any addresses, they're almost useless.
In Leeds city centre, I met Colin, a quiet, intense graphic designer who's been unemployed for 3 years. He was one of the 400,000 people who had to go onto the Flexible New Deal.
The computers were very slow. There weren't nowhere near enough members of staff. They were often run off their feet, and they had to deal with people from all different abilities. And I think that's one of the big problems now. It's what I call an LCD approach, a lowest common denominator. It doesn't matter whether you've got a degree or whether you've got reading and writing difficulties. You are treated at the same basic level. You are not treated as an individual.
Other claimants we spoke to related similar stories of poor materials, inadequate training and ineffective staff. Flexible New Deal only ran for just over a year before it was killed off by the coalition government. And its results don't make for happy reading. The best performing company only got 20% of people into employment, way below the government target.
And when the programme aired, for some unknown reason, I was like public enemy number one. I was like Pauline off the League of Gentlemen. Well, I love that programme. I absolutely loved it.
Hayley Taylor was on the front line of the Flexible New Deal. She became a poster girl for A4E, one of the companies brought in to deliver the programme, and her no-nonsense style turned her into a TV star. Now, though, she's willing to openly criticise her former employer and highlight the concerns she had about the project.
The tipping point for me was when I walked into a class one day with what I had to deliver, and I have an 18-year-old sitting there who's never worked at all and has no intention of ever wanting to go to work, and a 55-year-old who's just been made redundant, whose world has just completely fallen apart. And I have to stand there at my board, pen in hand, and deliver the same lesson to two individuals who were years apart, poles apart in understanding, not on any level at all similar to each other, and never would be, in my opinion. And I am having to match a generic lesson to two people who would never, ever benefit from that. And I just thought to myself, I can't do this anymore.
Criticisms like this have led A4E to gain an unenviable reputation among some claimants. There's even a critical website which specifically tracks their performance. So does Nigel Lemon, who's in charge of welfare programmes at the company, except they haven't always been up to scratch.
Mistakes may have been made in the past, but, it's about what happens from this point forward.
You seem to have a bit of a negative reputation. Do you think that's fair?
No, I don't think that's fair. I mean, I think for 20 years, A4E has set out to improve people's lives, and we have created, a new job and a potential new lifestyle for someone every 3 minutes in the UK under the programmes previously. So we've helped hundreds of thousands of people. Unfortunately, there will always be one or two who we haven't been able to do everything we'd like, but we'll keep working with them until we get them into employment.